In the first two parts of this series, we looked at how the self takes shape through the body and through psychology. We looked at how the body's already orienting before you ever have anything to put into words. And we looked at how those bodily shifts become felt experience and interpretation and identity. It's how a state becomes an experience, how an experience becomes a story, and how over time those stories start to feel like who you are. But there's still another layer that we haven't talked about yet, because there are parts of your experience that biology alone can't explain, and there's parts that can't be fully explained by psychology either. So let's take something simple. Let's say that you open the fridge because you're hungry. That part makes sense. The body's regulating energy. Your attention narrows, so the food becomes salient, and the narrative comes online that I'm hungry, I should go eat. So you get up to go open the fridge, but after you open the door, something changes. You pause, because now your hunger has suddenly become a moral event. And now the moment isn't so simple. It's about what kind of person you are, whether you're disciplined, whether you're failing, whether you're good, whether you're living up to some invisible standard. And that extra pressure doesn't come from the body alone. But it also isn't just a private story you invented in isolation. It comes from somewhere larger. It comes from a world of inherited meaning, a world of values and roles and ideals and judgments and expectations and standards you were born into before you ever started trying to define yourself. And that's the layer that we're moving on to here. This is the layer that I call the symbolic plane. The symbolic plane is where personal experience becomes organized by shared structures of meaning through culture, language, roles, ideals, rituals, taboos, and deeper patterns that connect personal life patterns to larger human patterns. And just like the biological and psychological planes, the symbolic plane can also be understood in three different layers. So we have collective awareness, we have synchronistic awareness, and deep structural awareness. So let's begin with the first layer, which is collective awareness. Collective awareness begins with the recognition that your identity isn't only something you make inside of yourself. It's co-authored. You're writing it, yes, but the group is editing it in real time. And not only through explicit rules, like an employee handbook or like a school code or the laws of the land, but through subtler forces too, like what we're allowed to laugh at. The laugh that rewards the right kind of joke, the silence that follows the wrong kind of comment. It's the compliments that train you, the raised eyebrow that corrects you, the invitation you don't receive or do receive or whatever. And these little differences between groups can sometimes make you feel inauthentic. And you might ask yourself, well, why am I different around different people? But that question already assumes that the self is supposed to be sealed and self-contained, like a little sovereign nation behind your eyes. And it's not. In reality, the self is permeable. We're shaped in relationship. So we come into being inside of a world of meaning that's already there before we ever tried to define ourselves. So maybe the clearest way to explain this is through a familiar experience that we can all relate to in some way. So you go home for the holidays, and you've been living your entire adult life. You've changed, you've grown, you have responsibilities, you made decisions, you've become competent in ways that you weren't before. And then you walk in the front door, and there's the smell, and there's the hallway, there's that familiar tension in the air, or the old jokes, whatever it is. And within 20 minutes, you're acting like you're 16 again. And you start performing the same old strategies. Maybe for you, it's humor, or it's being the fixer, or whatever your old position in that system used to be. And you can kind of feel it too. You can feel it shift. Even though you've changed in all kinds of ways, for the moment, you get kind of stuck right back inside an older version of yourself. So what's happening there? What's happening there is you're being reabsorbed into a living system that you once belonged to. And whenever you step back into that system, your old position in the pattern tends to switch back on. Because a family isn't just a set of individuals, it functions more like a shared nervous system. So no single person has to obviously be in charge. The signals move through the group fast enough so that everyone adjusts to everyone else, often without realizing it. And just like other living systems, the family tends to optimize for the whole collective stability and not necessarily for your individual growth. So whenever the tension rises, whenever there's grief or conflict or addiction or money problems or resentment or whatever, the system will just redistribute that strain in order to keep from rupturing. And it usually doesn't happen consciously. People participate in these things unconsciously. And one of the main ways that this happens is through roles. Now, roles aren't exactly personality traits. They're functions inside of a network of relationships. So you see these familiar ones in stereotypical families. So you see like the hero or the achiever. That's the one in the family that succeeds, the one that makes the family look competent, and the one that makes everyone feel like we're okay, we're making it. Then you have the scapegoat or the problem child, the one who carries blame or anger or the chaos of the family so that the deeper issues in the family system don't have to be faced directly. And then there's the mascot or the clown, the one who sort of diffuses the tension with humor and keeps the atmosphere from boiling over and makes things more bearable. And then maybe another one is the lost child or the quiet one. This is the one who becomes invisible or low maintenance or easy to overlook, so the system doesn't have to absorb even more complexity. Now, these roles don't usually form because someone sat down and assigned them. They form through unconscious reinforcement. So over time, you get conditioned to do what you had to do to stabilize the emotional reality of the unit that you were in. And that stabilizing blueprint that you get becomes a kind of automatic posture that you carry into the world. It's a shape. It shapes what you expect, what you notice, what feels familiar, what role you're likely to slip into whenever pressure rises. And over time, that whole pattern hardens into your identity. But it goes beyond the family. The family is just one form. This same dynamic also exists in friend groups, in schools, and workplaces, in churches, in online communities, in nations, in cultures. And every system has its rules. What is admirable? What is embarrassing? What earns praise? What gets spoken out loud? And what has to be whispered quietly? So you don't consciously choose your values. You inherit a value climate and you adapt to it. So you learn what version of you gets rewarded, what version gets corrected, and what version gets completely left out. And you build yourself accordingly. So then, if you develop deep enough of a reflection, you can begin to examine that inheritance. You can begin to ask, which parts of this are actually mine? Which parts did I just absorb to try to belong? And that matters because the system that you grew up in, or the systems that you grew up in, aren't separate from you. Okay, they've shaped you into anticipating a certain kind of world. So to become aware of those scripts that you're participating in is to begin breaking the illusion that the self is something that's purely private. It's easy to think that the self is this individual phenomenon. The body sends these signals, the mind turns those signals into experience, and that experience turns into identity. But collective awareness is where that illusion starts to break, because you begin to see that your identity wasn't ever formed in a vacuum. It was formed inside families, inside friend groups, inside schools, inside workplaces. And every one of those rooms has an invisible symbolic script. And over time, the rules don't just stay in the room. They become part of you. They become unconscious expectations of what kind of person you're allowed to be. Now, once you've started to understand the story that you're living at the psychological level, once you can see the roles that you're living out in the collective field, something in your perception can begin to change. You stop experiencing life just as this private drama in your head. So the boundary between inner and outer starts to soften. And that's where the next level begins, which is synchronistic awareness. So synchronistic awareness is a higher level of perception. You begin to notice patterns of correspondence that were already there, but you didn't previously have the sensitivity to really notice or feel just yet. And that sensitivity grows, or that sensitivity tends to grow as the lower levels of the self become more integrated. So the more clearly you can feel your own affect, your emotions, the more you can notice your perceptions, and the more that you can understand the narratives that organize your identity, the less trapped you are inside of them. And whenever that happens, patterns that were previously unconscious or half conscious become easier to recognize in the situations and relationships and moments that your life keeps arranging around. It's what happens when you're aware of the fact that what's going on inside of you can be mirrored back to you by something outside of you. And in that moment, the in and outer don't feel so separate anymore. So usually the inner part is unresolved. So something like a fear or a question or a conflict or some kind of grief inside. And the outer part is the thing that brings it into view. It's a comment that someone makes, a look that someone has, a conversation or a chance moment. So here's an example of what I mean. Let's say you've been quietly wrestling with something. Maybe whether you always over-explain yourself or whether you keep apologizing for things. And then over time, a day, a week, a month, whatever it is, that exact theme keeps showing up in your life in different forms. A friend makes an offhand comment, for example, or you hear a line in a podcast, or you catch yourself doing whatever the thing is in real time. And suddenly, it all just kind of clicks. It's not just that you notice the same theme a few times. It's that for a moment, you see the whole pattern all at once. You see how these moments all connect. You see the same shape across time in different forms. And that sudden visibility carries a deep sense of meaning, because something that had been half buried inside of you has now become visible through the world that you're moving through. So that's the shift in perception at synchronistic awareness. So the world starts to feel like a field of correspondence. It's a place where something happening inside of you and something happening outside of you meet in a way that reveals meaning. Now, someone could hear that and say, well, it just sounds like you're noticing patterns. Everyone notices patterns. And that's true. Everyone does notice patterns. But that by itself isn't what I mean, because before you understand your own story clearly, and before you can see the roles you tend to fall into with other people, you usually interpret the world in a very self-centered way without realizing it. So you take everything at face value as proof of whatever you already believe. So if you fear rejection, everything starts to look like rejection. If you want approval, everything starts to look like approval. If you already have a story about who you are, you tend to make every pattern fit that story. So synchronistic awareness becomes accessible when you're clear enough to stop forcing everything back into the same ego story. And when that starts to happen, it starts revealing something even deeper, a deeper rhythm that's been unfolding through your life. And that leads us to the next level, which is called deep structural awareness. So, deep structural awareness begins when the patterns you've been noticing stop feeling like meaningful moments and start feeling like expressions of the same deeper shape. At synchronistic awareness, at the synchronistic level, life starts to feel responsive. Things echo. But deep structural awareness goes one step further, because now it's not just that the world is reflecting something back to you, it's that your life itself starts to look like it's been unfolding through a recurring structure the whole time, like a pattern or a rhythm or a motif, a deeper architecture beneath the story. So, for example, maybe you start realizing that you keep on getting in different relationships with different people in different seasons of your life, but somehow the emotional shape is strangely similar. Maybe in one relationship you were the pursuer, in another one you were pulling away, in another you told yourself that this was completely different. But after enough reflection, you start to notice that underneath the surface differences, the same deeper tension has been playing itself out all along, again and again. It's the same fear, it's the same longing, it's the same attempt to solve something unfinished. So in a way, your life feels like a record player running on a continuous loop. And this reveals that there may be certain patterns in your life that are older than your current expectations. So older than the story that you usually tell yourself, and sometimes even older than your conscious self-image. And so what that means is that the deep structure patterns don't usually flatter your ego. In fact, the knowledge of the deep pattern often arrives to confront you. It's there to show you what's still unresolved or unlived, or what role you keep performing. And that tends to keep looping until you learn how to integrate it. And once that looping becomes visible, you don't experience your life quite in the same way anymore. You realize that maybe your life hasn't been random in the way that it's felt. Maybe your reoccurring struggles aren't just bad luck. Maybe the patterns that you keep running into aren't there just to be analyzed, but to be answered. So the question starts to become, what is this pattern that I'm noticing in my life asking of me? What part of me is still trying to come into form? What has my life been trying to show me over and over again in different languages until I finally learn how to see it? And that there is sort of the threshold here. It's the moment that you stop seeing your life as just a collection of experience and to begin to see it as an unfolding structure or a living pattern.